Welcome to Grey Vale Echoes. Dive into chilling Gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Some family secrets are not buried with the dead. They linger like a fog. Tonight, we enter a deathbed chamber in a remote mansion, where a hidden truth about an unseen child refuses to stay silent. Our story tonight begins in a place where secrets are born and where they come to die, often in the very same room. We find ourselves in the west wing of Porthgenna Tower, a grim, granite mansion clinging to the cliffs of the Cornish coast. It was a house built to withstand the fury of the Atlantic gales, a fortress of stone and secrets, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless, restless sea. And within this fortress, in a grand, decaying bedchamber known as the Myrtle Room, a life was drawing to its close. But this was not to be a peaceful end. This was to be a battle, a final, desperate struggle not against death, but against a silence that had lasted for 20 years. The dying matriarch, Mrs. Treverton, lay propped up against a mountain of pillows. The room was a testament to a life of wealth and privilege, with its heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the fading afternoon light, its massive, dark wood furniture looming like silent beasts in the gloom. But all the wealth in the world could not buy a peaceful conscience. Sickness had hollowed out her face, leaving her skin as pale and translucent as fine porcelain. Her breath was a shallow, rattling thing in the oppressive quiet of the room. But it was her eyes that told the true story. They were wide, dark pools of a terror that was not of the body. This was not the fear of physical pain, nor the simple fear of death's finality. This was a profound spiritual horror. It was the terror of a soul approaching the gates of judgment with a terrible, unconfessed sin clutched in its hand. Her gaze darted around the room, not seeing the familiar objects, but seeing something else, something unseen that had come to wait with her for the end. She was not alone in her vigil. Seated on a small, straight-back chair beside the bed was her faithful servant, Sarah Leeson. Sarah was a quiet, unassuming woman in her middle years, her face etched with the lines of a life of loyal, thankless service. She had been with Mrs. Treverton for decades, a silent shadow to her mistress's grand life. She had nursed her through this final illness with a devotion that went beyond duty. But in these final days her role had changed. She was no longer just a nurse. She had been chosen for a different, more terrible purpose. She was to be the vessel for a final confession, the sole inheritor of a secret that had festered in the heart of this family for a generation. Sarah could feel the secret in the room. It was a tangible presence, as real as the heavy, ornate furniture. It was a poison that had leached into the very air, making it thick and hard to breathe. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, with the immense pressure of a truth that had been suppressed for so long it had gained a malevolent life of its own. She could see it in her mistress's eyes, this frantic, desperate need to speak, to unburden herself before it was too late. And she could see, with a growing sense of dread, that something was actively preventing it. The secret was not a passive thing. It was fighting back. This is where the true drama, the heart of our unsolved mystery, begins. It is in the agonizing, repeated attempts of a dying woman to speak, and the terrible, unseen force that chokes the words in her throat. Mrs. Treverton's existence had been reduced to a single, all-consuming need. The need to speak of a child. The word would surface periodically in her feverish, disjointed ramblings. She would thrash in her bed, her thin, frail hands clutching at the bedsheets, her eyes wide with a desperate urgency. "The child, Sarah," she would rasp, her voice a dry, papery whisper. "You must know about the child." But who was this child? Sarah had been with the family for years, and she knew of no other child. There was only Rosamond, Mrs. Treverton's beloved daughter, now a young woman herself, far away and unaware of her mother's desperate state. This mention of another child, a mysterious, enigmatic figure from the past, was a crack appearing in the smooth, polished facade of the Treverton family history. It hinted at a hidden truth, a family secret so profound that it had been buried for decades, and was now, in these final hours, clawing its way to the surface. Each time Mrs. Treverton gathered the strength to approach the subject, a visible transformation would come over her. A flicker of her old, commanding self would return. Her back would straighten slightly against the pillows. Her eyes would focus on Sarah with a piercing clarity, and she would open her mouth to speak. Sarah would lean in, her own heart pounding, her entire being focused on receiving the confession, on easing her mistress's tormented soul. She knew that this secret was the key to the terror that was consuming the dying woman. She felt that if the truth could only be spoken, a kind of peace might descend upon this tortured room. But peace was not to be found in the Myrtle Room. The moment the confession was imminent, The moment the crucial words were about to be formed, something would intervene. It was a fear, a pure and absolute fear, that would rise up and overwhelm her. It was as if an invisible hand were clamping itself over her mouth, choking the words before they could be born. Her eyes would lose their focus, darting away from Sarah towards the darkest corner of the room, or towards the tall, imposing wardrobe that stood like a silent, black tombstone against the far wall. Her face, which had been alight with purpose, would slacken into a mask of stark, primal terror. Her body would be seized by a violent tremor, her hands flying to her throat as if to ward off an invisible assailant. The attempt would be over. The strength would drain from her, leaving her panting and weaker than before, a ship that had tried to break free of a dark harbor only to be smashed back against the rocks. The fear that stopped her was more than just the simple anxiety of revealing a long-held secret. Sarah could see that. It was a specific, directed terror. Her mistress was not just afraid of the secret. She was afraid of something in the room with them. It was a fear that seemed to have a presence of its own. A silent, watchful guardian that had been tasked with ensuring the secret remained a secret, even at the cost of a soul's damnation. Sarah watched this agonizing cycle repeat itself again and again. The desperate rally, the attempt to speak, the sudden, overwhelming wave of fear, and the final crushing defeat. It was a form of torture, a spiritual battle being waged in the landscape of a dying woman's conscience. And with each failed attempt, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, more charged, more malevolent. The secret was winning. It was feeding on Mrs. Treverton's life force, draining her of the very will to fight back. What could be so terrible that the fear of speaking it was greater than the fear of eternal damnation? Who was this unseen child, whose very existence was a source of such profound horror? Was it the memory of a child who had died tragically? A child who had been sent away? Or something far darker? A truth so monstrous that it had spawned its own spectral guardian to keep it buried? Sarah didn't know. All she knew was that she was a witness to a struggle between a dying woman and her own mysterious past, and the past was a powerful, terrifying foe. The family secret was not just a piece of hidden information. It was an active, malevolent force, and it was determined to drag Mrs. Treverton down into the grave with it. Her lips sealed, her soul unforgiven. And the name of this force, the key to the entire mystery, was the child. An unseen, unknown figure, whose shadow was long enough to stretch across 20 years and bring a cold, dark terror to a deathbed in a lonely house by the sea. To truly understand the terror that was unfolding in the Myrtle Room, you must understand the house itself. Porthgenna Tower was not a cheerful place. It was a Gothic beast of grey granite, a fortress built not for comfort but for endurance, hunched on the edge of the cliffs like a brooding predator watching the sea. Its architect had been more concerned with defiance than with beauty, and the result was a place of sharp angles, narrow windows, and long, echoing corridors. It was a house that seemed designed to hold secrets, its thick stone walls perfect for absorbing whispers and muffling screams. And on this particular evening, as the sun bled out over the horizon, the house seemed to be drawing its own dark atmosphere into the death chamber, amplifying the horror, becoming an active participant in the unfolding tragedy. The first and most constant presence was the sound. Outside the tall, mullioned window of the Myrtle Room, the Atlantic Ocean churned and sighed. This was not the rhythmic, soothing crash of waves on a summer beach. This was a sound of profound and eternal melancholy. The sea was a vast, gray, living entity, and its voice was one of sorrow. There was a constant, low moan as the wind swept across the surface of the water, a sound like 1,000 grieving souls. And beneath that was the sound of the waves themselves, as they met the sheer, black cliffs directly below the west wing. It was not a sharp, violent crash. It was a deep, resonant thump, followed by a long, drawn-out shush as the water was sucked back into the depths. It was a sound like a giant, sleeping creature breathing. A slow, labored inhalation, and then a long, weary exhalation. Thump shush, over and over, an endless, hypnotic rhythm of sorrow. It was the heartbeat of the house's despair, a constant, mournful reminder of the endless passage of time, of the futility of struggle, and of the immense, cold, uncaring power of nature. Sarah Leeson had lived with the sound for years, but tonight it seemed different, felt personal. It was no longer just the sound of the sea. It was a sigh of sympathy for her dying mistress. It was a lament for the secret that was being kept. It was the sound of the world itself weeping for the tragedy unfolding within these walls. Each long, sighing exhalation of the waves seemed to draw the warmth and hope from the room, leaving behind only a cold, damp residue of gloom. Then there was the sight. The door to the death chamber had been left slightly ajar, on Mrs. Treverton's breathless insistence. She seemed to fear being completely enclosed, Yet the sliver of a view it offered was arguably more terrifying than a sealed room. The doorway opened onto the main corridor of the west wing, a long, narrow passage that stretched away into almost total blackness. The feeble light from the single candle in the hallway, placed far down by the main staircase, did nothing to illuminate the space. It only served to make the darkness seem deeper, more solid. The corridor was a throat of blackness, a tunnel leading into the unknown heart of the house. And in this deep, oppressive dark, the shadows played tricks on the eyes. As Sarah sat by the bed, her gaze would inevitably be drawn to that sliver of impenetrable gloom. And she would see things, or she would think she saw things, a flicker of movement at the far end of the hall, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the wall and then melt back into it, the vague, indistinct shape of a person standing just beyond the range of the candlelight, a shape that would vanish the moment she tried to focus on it. Was it just her tired, overwrought mind playing tricks on her? A combination of the flickering candlelight and the natural settling of the old house? She told herself it was, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The hallway did not feel empty. It felt like a stage, waiting in the wings of the Myrtle Room, its dark, silent actors poised for their cue. The corridor was more than just a passage. It was a conduit. It was the path by which the unseen fear seemed to enter the room, the channel through which the house's malevolence was being funneled directly into the death chamber. Every time her mistress's eyes darted in terror, it was towards that black, watchful opening. The source of the fear was out there in the dark, waiting. And this brought Sarah to the feeling, the palpable texture of the air itself. The room was suffocating. The heavy velvet curtains, drawn to keep out the dying light, also served to keep out any fresh air. The atmosphere within was stagnant, thick, and heavy, like air from a long unopened cellar. It was a cocktail of oppressive smells. The sharp, cloying scent of medicine and laudanum was the most immediate, a constant reminder of the futile fight against the body's decay. Beneath that was the smell of the room itself, the musty, dusty scent of old wood, of damp stone, of fabric that hadn't been properly aired in a generation. But tonight, there was a third scent, a new element that had crept in with the fear. It was a faint, metallic tang, sharp and unpleasant. It was the smell of blood, but not quite. It was the scent of pure, undiluted fear. It was the odor of a body in extreme, prolonged terror, a chemical signal of distress that had saturated the very air, the curtains, the bedsheets. It made the air feel heavy and greasy, hard to breathe. Sarah found herself taking small, shallow breaths, as if the air itself were poison. It felt as though the secret, the hidden truth that was at the heart of all this, was a living organism, and it was consuming all the oxygen in the room, feeding on the fear and leaving behind this toxic, suffocating atmosphere. To be in the Myrtle Room was to feel as if you were slowly being smothered by the weight of a sin you had not committed. Finally, weaving all these sensory horrors together, there was the silence. Not an absence of sound, but a very specific and terrifying kind of quiet. It was the silence that existed between the other sounds. It was the deep, profound hush that fell in the brief moments between the sighing of the waves. It was the ringing quiet that filled the space between Mrs. Treverton's ragged, painful breaths. It was a silence that was not empty, but full. It was a listening silence. It felt as if the entire house, from its deep granite foundations to its wind-beaten rooftops, was holding its breath. It was leaning in, its stony ear pressed to the door of the Myrtle Room. It was waiting for the confession, waiting for the secret to finally be spoken. The silence was an active participant in the drama, a vast, invisible audience. In this quiet, every tiny sound was magnified into a shocking event. The rustle of Sarah's dress was a roar. The soft clink of a spoon against a glass was a thunderclap. The frantic, terrified beating of her own heart was a drum, announcing the approach of something terrible. This charged, expectant silence was the canvas upon which the other horrors were painted. It was the silence of a place that has witnessed great sorrow and is waiting to witness it again. It was the silence of a stage where a tragedy has been performed before and is about to be performed for the final time. It was a silence that was pregnant with a scream, and the tension of waiting for that scream to be born was an exquisite form of torture. So, you have the four elements that made up the haunted atmosphere of that room. The sorrowful, weeping voice of the sea, the watchful, menacing darkness of the corridor, the suffocating, fear-tainted air, and the profound, listening silence that bound it all together. Porthgenna Tower was not just a setting for this mystery. It was an accomplice. It was providing the perfect environment for the secret to thrive, for the fear to grow. It was a house that was actively helping a hidden truth to win its final battle against a dying woman. And as the night deepened, the house seemed to press in closer, its dark, Gothic heart beating in time with the sighing of the waves, waiting for the final, terrible act to begin. The evening wore on, each moment stretching into a small eternity. The battle in the Myrtle Room had reached a terrible stalemate. Mrs. Treverton would drift into a shallow, restless sleep, her face a mask of tormented exhaustion, only to be jolted awake by a fresh wave of terror, her lips moving silently, her eyes wide with the horror of her unspoken secret. Sarah Leeson sat by her side, a helpless sentinel, her own nerves stretched to the breaking point. The oppressive atmosphere of the room, with its sighing sea and its watchful, dark corridor, had worked its way into her own soul. She felt a creeping dread that was not just sympathy for her mistress, but a personal fear for what this night might bring. The family secret was a contagion, and she had been exposed for too long. Just as the last of the gray evening light finally surrendered to the full, impenetrable black of a moonless night, something in the room changed. The endless, agonizing cycle of struggle and defeat was about to be broken. It seemed as if both the dying woman and the house itself knew that the time for pretense was over. This would be the final attempt, the last charge. One way or another, the war would end tonight. It began with a sudden, startling moment of clarity. Mrs. Treverton's eyes, which had been glassy and unfocused, suddenly snapped into sharp, intelligent focus. The fog of sickness and fear seemed to recede, burned away by a final, incandescent burst of will. She pushed herself up in the bed, not with the feeble, trembling movements of before, but with a surprising, almost shocking display of strength. It was the last, desperate surge of energy a dying fire gives before it is extinguished forever. She was gathering all of her remaining life force, all the vestiges of her once formidable personality, for one last, titanic effort to break free from the chains of her own past. Her eyes locked onto Sarah's. There was no confusion in them now, only a raw, desperate plea that was more powerful than any spoken word. It was a look that said, "Help me. Do not let me fail this time. My soul depends on it." Sarah felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment had finally come. She leaned forward, her entire being concentrated on her mistress, her hand instinctively reaching out and gripping the old woman's frail, cold fingers. She tried to pour her own strength into her, to lend her will to the fight. "I'm here, ma'am," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly.
"I'm listening."
Tell me what I need to know." Mrs. Treverton's gaze held hers, a silent pact of desperation passing between them. The sounds of the house, the sighing sea, the groaning timbers seemed to fade into the background. For a brief, crystalline moment, there were only the two of them in the room, two women united against the terrible, unseen force that had held them captive. She was going to do it. She was going to defy the guardian of the secret. She was going to speak. Her lips, which had been pale and dry, parted. A faint, rasping sound, the noise of a voice that has not been used for days, emerged from her throat. It was a struggle, a physical effort to force air over atrophied vocal cords. But the will behind it was immense. Sarah leaned closer still, her ear just inches from her mistress's mouth, terrified of missing a single precious syllable. And then the words began to form. "The child." The voice was a mere ghost of a sound, a dry, fragile whisper that was almost stolen by the heavy silence of the room. But Sarah heard it. The two words that were the key to the entire mystery, the source of all the terror. They hung in the air between them, imbued with a weight of 20 years of secrecy and sorrow. It was the beginning. The lock had been turned. The door was beginning to creak open. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding. What would come next? A name? A place? An explanation for the enigma that had haunted this house for so long? Mrs. Treverton took another ragged, painful breath, marshalling her strength to continue. Her grip on Sarah's hand tightened, her knuckles white. She opened her mouth again, her expression one of fierce, defiant determination. She was going to win. She was going to set the truth free. And that is when the secret fought back for the last time. It did not come as a wave of internal fear this time. It came from outside. Just as she was about to speak again, her eyes, which had been locked on Sarah's, suddenly darted sideways. Her gaze shot past Sarah's shoulder, towards the open door and the black, menacing void of the corridor. And the expression on her face changed with a terrifying, instantaneous speed. The look of desperate determination was utterly annihilated, replaced by an expression of such absolute, stark, and abject terror that Sarah felt her own blood run cold. It was a look of recognition. This was not the vague, formless fear of before. This was the specific horror of seeing a known and dreaded enemy. She was not looking at the darkness. She was looking at something in the darkness. Something that had finally revealed itself. Something that had been waiting patiently in the wings and had now stepped onto the stage. Sarah, in that split second, felt the presence behind her. She didn't see anything, she didn't hear anything, but she felt a sudden, profound drop in temperature, a pocket of glacial cold in the stagnant air of the room. She felt the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The feeling of being watched, which had been a vague, unsettling background hum, now became a sharp, focused, and malevolent stare directed at her back. There was someone or something standing in the doorway. The guardian of the secret had finally shown its face, and the sight of it was enough to shatter the will of a dying woman. Mrs. Treverton's body went limp. It was as if her very soul had been extinguished by what she had seen. The last, defiant spark of her life force was snuffed out in an instant. The strength drained from her completely, her body slumping back against the pillows as if her bones had turned to water. Her grip on Sarah's hand loosened, her fingers falling away, cold and lifeless. Her jaw went slack, her head lolling to one side. The battle was over. The secret had won. A single, final exhalation of breath escaped her lips. It was not a word. It was not a sigh. It was a whisper of absolute and utter defeat. A sound of a soul surrendering to damnation. "It's too late," she breathed, her voice so faint it was barely a whisper on the air. "God forgive me." And then, there was silence. The silence of a final breath. The silence of a final heartbeat. The silence of a final thought. Mrs. Treverton was gone. But her terror, her final horrified expression, was seared into Sarah's memory. A permanent, ghostly afterimage. The secret had not just won. It had triumphed. It had held its silence until the very end, and it had taken its keeper with it into the great, final darkness, her confession unspoken, her sin unabsolved. The dead secret was now truly and eternally dead. Or so it seemed. For a long, suspended moment the world seemed to end. The death of Mrs. Treverton was not a gentle fading away. It was a sudden, violent cessation. It was as if a string had been cut, and the very life of the room had collapsed with her. The silence that fell in the wake of her final, defeated whisper was unlike any silence that had come before. It was not the heavy, listening silence of anticipation. It was the vast, empty, and terrifying silence of an aftermath. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. A silence thick with the ghosts of what had just happened. Sarah Leeson remained frozen, half bent over the bed, her hand still hovering in the space where her mistress's fingers had been just moments before. The faint warmth she had felt was gone, replaced by the encroaching, deep cold of the room. Her mind refused to process what had just happened. The final horrified look in Mrs. Treverton's eyes, the whispered words of defeat, the sudden, absolute stillness of the body before her, it was a sequence of events so terrible and so swift that her senses couldn't keep up. She was trapped in the amber of that final, horrific moment. The only sound was the distant, indifferent sea, sighing its endless, mournful song. The sound, which had been a source of oppressive gloom, now seemed a universe away, a sound from a different, living world that had no connection to this cold, dead chamber. In here, there was only the ringing silence of a finished life and an unfinished story. The tension, which had been stretched to a fine, vibrating wire, did not snap. It simply solidified, turning the air in the room into a block of invisible, suffocating ice. The secret was safe. The guardian in the hallway had won. The story was over. But the story was not over. The secret was not finished. It had been silenced, but it had not been laid to rest. And in the profound, tomb-like quiet of that room, just as Sarah began to think she might be trapped in this silent tableau forever, a new sound was born. And this sound would shatter the silence, and Sarah's sanity, completely. It began so faintly that at first, she thought it was a trick of her own overwrought mind, or perhaps a strange new note in the eternal sighing of the wind and waves. It was a thin, high-pitched sound, a fragile thread of noise woven into the thick tapestry of the silence. But it was not the wind. It was not the sea. It grew in volume, not by much, but just enough to become unmistakable. And it was coming from the one place she feared most. It was coming from the dark corridor. It was the sound of a child crying. It was not the loud, angry roar of a baby demanding attention. It was not the frustrated sob of a toddler who has fallen down. This was a sound of pure, desolate, and heartbreaking sorrow. It was the thin, reedy, hopeless wail of a child who has been lost for a very, very long time. It was a sound of utter loneliness, a cry that held within it an eternity of abandonment and grief. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world of stone and sea and dying old women. It was a sound from somewhere else entirely. The cry echoed in the long, narrow hallway, its sorrowful notes seeming to cling to the cold stone walls. It was a sound so full of pain that it was a physical blow. It struck Sarah with the force of an actual impact, knocking the breath from her lungs. Every parental, every human instinct in her body screamed in response to that sound. It was the one sound in the universe that is designed to bypass all thought, all reason, and demand an immediate, compassionate response. But compassion was impossible because the sound itself was impossible. It was the voice of the unseen child, the voice of the dead secret. The mystery was no longer a matter of whispers and fears and dying words. It had been given a voice, and its voice was the sound of unbearable sadness. For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed, caught between the dead woman in front of her and the impossible, living sound behind her. The cry continued, a steady, mournful wail that seemed to get no closer and no further away. It simply was, a feature of the hallway now, as real and as present as the darkness itself. Then, a surge of something, was it courage? Or a terror so great it propelled her into action? Shot through her. The image of her mistress's final, horrified stare flashed in her mind. Mrs. Treverton had seen something in that hallway. She had seen the source of this cry. And Sarah, despite every screaming instinct telling her to flee, had to know what it was. With a choked, strangled gasp, she spun around. She turned away from the bed, away from the dead, and faced the living horror. She looked directly down the throat of the dark corridor, the place that had been a source of such dread all evening, the place that her mistress had stared at in her final, terror-stricken moment. Her eyes, accustomed now to the deep gloom, scanned the entire length of the passage, from the doorway where she stood to the faint, flickering candle flame far, far down by the stairs. There was nothing there. The hallway was absolutely, completely, and undeniably empty. There was no child. There was no person. There was no spectral guardian. There were only shadows, deeper and more menacing than before, and the oppressive, solid block of darkness. The source of the cry was invisible. The sound was coming from an empty space. It was a voice without a body, a sorrow without a source. And yet the crying continued. It did not falter. The heartbreaking, lonely wail of a lost child echoed from the empty, shadow-choked corridor, a sound that had no physical cause, a pure and direct manifestation of the supernatural. The chilling encounter that had been lurking at the edges of the evening had now taken center stage. This was not a family secret anymore. This was a ghost story. The combination was too much for a human mind to bear. The long, agonizing hours of the death watch, the oppressive, haunted atmosphere of the house, the final, terrible defeat of her mistress, and now this impossible, disembodied cry of a ghostly, sorrowful child, emanating from a void of pure darkness. It was the final straw, the single terrifying event that shattered the fragile dam of her composure. Sarah's strength, which had sustained her through so much, simply vanished. Her legs, which had been locked and trembling, gave out from under her. A strangled, animal sound of pure terror escaped her own lips, a sound that was half scream, half sob. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the dark corridor blurring into a gray, swirling vortex. The last thing she saw was the empty, mocking darkness. The last thing she heard was that thin, desolate, unending cry. And then the world dissolved into blackness. She crumpled to the floor in a heap, a faint, her consciousness fleeing from a reality that had become too horrifying to endure. She collapsed onto the threshold of the myrtle room, a silent, fallen soldier, caught in the crossfire between the dead and the damned. The house fell silent once more, but it was a different silence now. The cry was gone. The tension was broken. But in its place, a new, terrible certainty had settled. The secret was not dead. It had simply changed its form. It was no longer a memory locked inside a dying woman's mind. It was now a presence, a voice, a ghost, a lost, weeping child that now walked the cold, dark corridors of Porthgenna Tower. The mystery had not been solved. It had been unleashed. When Sarah Leeson finally returned to the world of the living, it was to a room that was both the same and irrevocably different. The first thing she was aware of was the cold. The hard, polished wood of the floorboards beneath her cheek was like a slab of ice. The second was the silence. The terrible, impossible cry was gone. All that remained was the low, mournful sigh of the sea, a sound that now seemed less like a lament and more like the eternal, weary breathing of a world that had seen this all before and would see it all again. She pushed herself up slowly, her limbs aching, her head throbbing with a dull, heavy pain. Her mind was a fog of confusion and remembered terror. She looked at the bed. The still, silent form of her mistress lay there, a pale statue in the gloom. She looked down the long, dark corridor. It was empty. The shadows were just shadows again. The oppressive presence was gone. The chilling encounter was over. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind a strange, unnatural calm and the wreckage of what had come before. But was it over? As the fog in her mind began to clear, replaced by the sharp, crystalline memory of the cry, Sarah understood that this was not an ending. It was a transformation. The mystery had not been resolved with Mrs. Treverton's death. It had merely been set free. That cry, that impossible sound of sorrow, was the proof. It was not just a random, spectral noise. It was the voice of the dead secret itself. For 20 years, the secret had been a prisoner, locked away in the mind of one woman, a silent, festering wound. But now its jailer was dead, and the secret had been given its own voice, its own life. It was an echo of a mysterious past, a sorrow so powerful that it had torn a hole in the fabric of reality and had cried out through it. The weeping child was the ghost of a hidden truth, and it now had the freedom of the entire house to roam. This revelation, chilling as it was, immediately gave rise to the central, agonizing question. The question that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her days, and that forms the very core of our unsolved mystery tonight. Who is this enigmatic child? The cry had been so real, so full of genuine, heartbreaking life. What was its source? The most immediate and perhaps most terrifying explanation was that it was a ghost. The spirit of a child who had met a tragic end within the walls of Porthgenna Tower. A child whose death was so steeped in sorrow and injustice that its spirit was trapped here, doomed to forever weep its loneliness into the cold, empty corridors. If this were true, then the identity of the child became a historical mystery of the most profound and tragic kind. Was it a child of the Treverton family, a sibling to Rosamond whose existence had been erased from the family records? Had it been born in secret and died in secret, its life and death a shame to be buried and forgotten? The very thought sent a shiver of pure Gothic horror through Sarah. The house, with its grim stone walls and its history of brooding inhabitants, suddenly seemed like a vast, unmarked tomb. How many other secrets, how many other sorrows, were buried within its foundations? The cry of the unseen child might only be the one that had finally managed to make itself heard. The family secret, then, was not just a matter of inheritance or identity, but a story of a life that had been tragically, and perhaps violently, cut short. But there was another possibility, a thought that was, in its own way, just as disturbing. What if the cry was not the sound of a ghost? What if it was a psychic echo, a kind of paranormal residue left behind by an event of extreme emotional distress? A place memory, where the stone and wood of the house itself had absorbed the sorrow of a moment from long ago and was now replaying it, like a ghostly recording. In this case, the child might not have died here at all. Perhaps the terrible event that caused the weeping was a separation. A child being torn from its mother's arms, sent away to live a life in exile. Its true identity a hidden truth that could destroy the family's reputation. This opened up a new and terrifying avenue of thought. If the child hadn't died, then it must have grown up. Somewhere out there in the world, there could be a living, breathing person, a man or a woman, completely unaware of their true parentage, unaware that they were the rightful heir to the Treverton name and fortune. The secret Mrs. Treverton had been so desperate to confess might have been the key to finding this person, to righting a 20-year-old wrong. The weeping, then, was not the cry of a dead child, but the eternal psychic cry of an abandoned one, an echo of a primal wound that had never healed. The weeping was the sound of a life that had been stolen. This second possibility cast a new and terrible light on the events of the evening. The fear that had paralyzed Mrs. Treverton, the terror she saw in the hallway, it all suddenly made a different kind of sense. The force that had guarded the secret, that had prevented her confession, was not just protecting the memory of a dead child. It was actively working to maintain the lie. It was a force dedicated to preserving the current order, to keeping the hidden truths buried. Mrs. Treverton's confession would have been an earthquake, shattering the foundations of her family. The phantom cry was a manifestation of the immense emotional power, the sorrow and injustice, that lay at the heart of that secret. It was a supernatural warning, a demonstration of the terrible power that would be unleashed if the truth ever came to light. Proved why she was so afraid. The secret was not just a piece of information. It was a sleeping dragon, and her words would have woken it. The cry from nowhere, then, was the central clue in this unsolved mystery. But it was a clue that only deepened the enigma. It confirmed the existence of the child, but it gave no clear answer as to its fate. It was a signpost pointing in two opposite, and equally terrifying, directions. One path led to a forgotten grave and the ghost of a murdered child. The other led to a living, breathing person, a stolen life, and a conspiracy of silence that had been maintained for 2 decades. Both possibilities were steeped in the kind of Gothic romance and family secrets that fester in the dark, lonely corners of old houses and old bloodlines. And this leaves us with the final and most chilling set of questions. The questions that lingered in the air of the Myrtle Room long after Sarah Leeson had fled from it. The questions that we are left with tonight. The cry was the voice of the mystery. But what was it trying to say? Was it a cry for help from a trapped and lonely spirit? Or was it a cry of warning? A threat of the chaos that would ensue if its story were ever truly known? If we believe it was the ghost of a child who died, we must ask the darkest question of all. What terrible thing happened to this child? How did it die? And who was responsible for its death? The answer to that would surely lie buried with the secrets Mrs. Treverton took to her grave. The weeping would then be an eternal accusation, a cry for a justice that can never be served. But if we believe that the child did not die, if we believe that somewhere out there, a life was continuing in ignorance, then the question becomes even more immediate and perhaps more haunting. The question that hangs in the cold, sea-damp air, the question that is the very essence of this unsolved mystery: is that child still alive? Is there a person walking the earth today who holds the key to this hidden truth? A person who is the living embodiment of the dead secret? And if so, will they ever know? Or will the only proof of their true identity be the faint, ghostly sound of a child weeping in a dark, empty corridor in a lonely house by the sea? We may never know, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying part of all. The cry fades, leaving only the sound of the sea and an unsolved mystery hanging in the cold air. The hidden truth remains locked away, but its ghost now walks the halls of Porthgenna Tower. We are left to wonder, who is this unseen child? And more importantly, is that child still alive somewhere? Or was that simply the eternal cry of a ghost? Let me know what you believe. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more Gothic chills from the unseen world.